Good evening and welcome to all the viewers of Mojo Story, our independent digital platform where we put people first when we approach the news. On the program today, we'll be talking to one of India's foremost vaccine scientists and medical researchers as hopes soar over a COVID vaccine. Different companies, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, or Astrazeneca and the Oxford Vaccine Project, are talking about significant progress. But is the worst really behind us? Remember, all this talk of hope and a vaccine is coming at a time when the COVID scare has actually returned to India. Here in Delhi, where we are, we have been bringing you relentless ground reports from graveyards, crematoriums, and hospitals where space is running short once again. COVID coverage has been at the center of our ground reportage this year, and it will continue to be, with one motto only: facts first and no rhetoric. Science should guide these conversations. And I welcome to the program Professor Gagandeep Kang, who, as I said, is one of the topmost vaccine scientists in the country. A very warm welcome, ma'am. Do you feel as hopeful as the headlines suggest that we should be? Because on the one hand, there are all these claims that are being made by companies like Pfizer or Moderna or the Serum Institute and so on. But on the other hand, as someone who's pretty much spent most of this year reporting the pandemic, I can tell you that in many cities across India, things are really bad again. And, we are looking at exactly what happened at the peak of COVID in months of July and August, which is not enough ICU beds, shortage of ventilators, people running from pillar to post to get beds in hospitals. So on the one hand, things seem to be very grave again. On the other hand, you have all this talk of a vaccine. So are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. Way more than I was 2 weeks ago, because 2 weeks ago we did not have the results from Pfizer and from Moderna, and the results exceeded all our expectations. We did not expect in an interim analysis to get over 90% efficacy, and to have 95% efficacy, which is 90% against severe disease, is truly phenomenal. It isn't all of the data. We have not seen full reporting. This is press releases. But these companies would not put out a press release if they did not trust their data to hold up. So I'm very, very hopeful that we will have products, and soon.
Now, when you say we will have products and soon, here in India, which of these products do you believe is of relevance to us? And I ask this because Pfizer certainly has, after an initial meeting, no formal understanding with any companies in India. Most of our focus has been on 5 vaccines that have not yet declared any data-driven progress. The Astrazeneca Oxford Vaccine Project has said that their vaccine has shown progress in older adults and not so much in younger adults. So from an Indian perspective purely, Professor Kang, what do you think?
I think we will have vaccines, and we will have them soon. It is not necessary for us to run after the front runners. Even if we look at Pfizer and Moderna, it's very likely, given the size of our market, that if we decide that we wanted the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, we could negotiate with the companies. The problem is, for most of these companies, their initial supply has already been booked through advance purchase commitments. But in time, it will be available. Both of these companies have manufacturing sites that are outside of the US that are intended to supply the rest of the world. So I'm sure that if the government and our companies were to talk to them, we could come to arrangements. The question I really have, and this is a topic of discussion, is should we be going after an mRNA vaccine for a public immunization program or not, given the challenges of delivering these vaccines? In my opinion at least, I think waiting a month or two to get vaccines that are more suited for delivery within our program would not be a bad trade-off. Even though we have data from Pfizer and Moderna, that's not a licensed vaccine as yet. It is promised of other vaccines.
can you explain for a layperson what your concerns are from an Indian perspective and why you think that it might actually be okay to not be at the front of the line, to not be behind the front runner, why it's actually okay to wait a couple of months and then process it?
India has a very huge population, 1.3 billion people. We have the largest immunization program in the world. We already deliver about 600 million vaccines every year. But our immunization program is focused largely on children, and now we have to build a stratified adult immunization program that will deliver vaccines in phases as vaccines become available. So, this is going to be a huge challenge. The logistics is a challenge, the planning is a challenge, the resources to buy the vaccine, the resources to get the vaccines to the people who need to receive them will be a challenge. And then we have to monitor vaccine safety as well. So, if we were able to use the existing cold chain capacity as far as possible, use our existing systems as far as possible, supplemented where necessary, I think that would result in a more robust immunization program than trying to build completely new infrastructure and utilize that for products that we might use only initially till the ones that are more suited for our program actually came along. And cost, of course, is a huge consideration because the vaccines that Moderna and Pfizer are looking at are in the tens of dollars a dose. And in India, we haven't had a vaccine that has been that expensive ever before.
Yeah. So actually, and we'll pull up those numbers, but Pfizer is talking about $20 per dose. Moderna is talking about $37 per dose, and we've got a 1,000 rupee figure as of now from the Oxford vaccine AstraZeneca project. These costs, who should pay for this vaccine and who should get it first? And there have been many different views on this. For example, Kiran Shaw of Biocon made a couple of points to me. She said that those who can afford it in India should pay the market rates for it, and of course it should be subsidized for the others. And she also believed that the program and the dissemination should be Aadhaar linked, and those comments actually created a huge sort of debate over whether that was necessary. What do you think, both in terms of who should pay for it, how many people should be made to pay for it, if at all, and should Aadhaar be the digital backbone for its dissemination?
So I think we have to look at the existing immunization program first. And if we look at any vaccine that has been recommended by the government to be given to any part of the population, that vaccine is always made available for free. I don't think this is a time for changing that. That said, even for the vaccines that are currently in the program and provided for free, much of the middle class does not take the vaccines from the public immunization system. It prefers to go to their private pediatricians, their private practitioners, who then provide vaccine for them, and the vaccines are paid for. I anticipate that it will wind up being a very similar situation. I don't think we should be asked to pay for the vaccine based on our economic standing, but maybe if you're in the middle class, you might have a greater repertoire of vaccines to choose from. As far as identification and how you go for identifying what the government calls beneficiaries,
Yes.
not a term I agree with, but
What is the
it
term?
does.
What is the term you'd use? What is the term you'd use?
I think it speaks to the fact that the government seems to be doing people a favor by delivering a service that is actually a right.
Yeah.
So I think it just needs to identify people as, we are the ones from government, or I used to be in government, so sorry about that.
That's
But
okay.
it's essentially you need.
It's like being in the army, right? It never leaves you.
So
but go ahead. Yeah.
I think you're service providers. So just like
Yeah.
doctors see patients and serve patients, I think the government serves its citizens.
Can you
So
speak to the Aadhaar contentious argument? Kiran, for example, argued that to create a new digital backbone will take too much time, and you do need some system of identification. The most ready system right now is Aadhaar. There were others who argued that, look, you did polio, etc., without Aadhaar, it was pre-Aadhaar done. But this is adult vaccination. We've never actually done it before on this scale.
So I think a good starting point is to compare polio with what we are thinking about now. In polio, you don't care about who's getting the vaccine. On the two national immunization days for polio, you set up vaccination centers all over the place, in markets, in hospitals, everywhere. And the only thing that is measured is how many doses of vaccine are given out, not whether a particular child got 2 doses of vaccine or
Sure,
not. That
sure.
monitoring happens by visiting the home of the child and documenting that they had received vaccination somewhere. If we look at this vaccine, you are going to have a vaccine that's in short supply. So you don't want to be wasting doses, and you want to make sure that target groups are covered. So you definitely need some form of identification. I have no opinion on which is the best form of identification, but the database that tracks people who have been immunized needs to be able to link together all identifiers.
Okay. Now, there are a bunch of vaccines, and most people don't understand what this actually means, right? At the end of the day, when we think of, and I'm going to be slightly dumb here and use non medical terms, when we think of a smallpox vaccine or chickenpox vaccine or whatever vaccine that we've all got, we think of it as being one vaccine, right? Here now we're talking suddenly of these multiple vaccines, these multiple sort of pharmaceutical companies, and we've got lots of questions from our viewers. Amit says, should we even care about mRNA vaccines? Is this affordable on a large scale in India? And what about cold storage? Now, some of these vaccines need minus 17, minus 80 degrees storage. Pfizer and Moderna certainly do. AstraZeneca says it can manage at about 2 to 6 degrees Celsius. In all scenarios, that's tough in India.
Okay. So, should we care about mRNA vaccines? Yes, we should, because the next time there's an outbreak, we should be the ones making the mRNA vaccine, because it's the vaccine that's been made and tested the quickest. To get to a vaccine readout for clinical efficacy in 10 months is absolutely incredible. I think we need to invest in the science and make sure we can make mRNA vaccines. Do we need them in India at this time? If we have other choices, if no other vaccines work, then obviously we need mRNA vaccines. If we have choices of other platforms, this is not something that I would go with in an emergent situation, given the complexities of cold storage. Now, the Moderna vaccine is actually a minus 20 vaccine that fits in our polio space very nicely. The Pfizer vaccine is one that requires minus 70 and probably is inappropriate for us right now. But there is a company in Pune that is making an mRNA vaccine and is intending to make that vaccine for 2 to 8 storage, which is exactly what our immunization program can handle. So if Genova's mRNA vaccine works, I see no reason why we should not be using that.
There's another question on our screen which says, are people going to have the option to choose vaccines? And, I think this is something that people are actually not understanding, right? We don't understand how this works. So here's what we know. I've got a few graphic slides here and I'll just pull them up. Here's what we know in press releases by these companies, not independently verified information. But, Pfizer, for example, you just mentioned, 95% effectiveness is what Pfizer is claiming with very few side effects. Pfizer is then going on to say that the storage requirements are minus 70 degrees. And you've made the point that may not be suitable for the Indian environment. And that point is well taken. And it's hoping to produce 50 million vaccine doses by 2020 alone. Now, Moderna is talking about a more expensive vaccine than even Pfizer. So there are also costs involved. So if you see the progress of all these different vaccines, which one gives you the most hope for the Indian context right now?
So I think both of these vaccines are on an mRNA platform. And as I mentioned, Genova is the only mRNA vaccine that is moving rapidly towards clinical development at the moment in India. But the fact that we have two vaccines that worked tells us that we at least have a hope of spike protein based vaccines working. There is
Mhm.
initial data from Gamaleya, which uses another platform, and I have concerns about Gamaleya because they release these results based on only 20 patients. Eh, the problem really is when you have only 20, you can't be absolutely confident that the results are right, as opposed to 94, 95 for Pfizer and for Moderna. But that is a different platform. And if those results are correct, that means we're going to have potentially lots of vaccines that work.
So what does that mean for us, the people, right? And like there are specific questions, for example, from Nikhil Katyal about the Serum Institute vaccine, which is of course tied up with the Oxford Vaccine Project and AstraZeneca, which has so far identified progress in older people more than middle-aged and younger people. Here, I do want to share something anecdotal with you, Professor Kang. In my travels across India, and some of the data released by the Indian Medical Association seems to bear this out. Very intriguingly, in India, people between the ages of 45 to their mid 60s seem to actually be responding in a worse way to this virus than older people. More older people are recovering. Even if you see doctor fatalities at the front line, it is hitting mid 50s population, my age group, late 40s, in quite an insidious way, in a way that it isn't happening in the rest of the world, right? So when we hear Serum Institute say it's doing better in older people, but not so much in people, in the middle age groups, what do you take away from that?
So, one, let's start with your findings of younger people doing badly. In India, you have a life expectancy of 68, 69 years. So, if you have someone over 70, they're actually quite unusual. And there is something called the survivor effect, that older people who survive beyond your normal life expectancy for a country might be unusual in being healthier than older people of a similar age in a different country. So
Yeah.
that's one possible explanation. Now, for AstraZeneca, the data that we are seeing is not efficacy data. The data that they are showing us is that the vaccine is inducing an immune response in older individuals. So, this is actually good news. It does not mean that the vaccine will not work in younger people. And if we are to look at Serum's partnership with AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford, I think that partnership is positioning them at the front of the pack where Indian vaccines are concerned, because we will have a clinical readout from the AstraZeneca studies being done in other parts of the world by Christmas. And Serum has already completed recruitment of the studies that it was doing in India. It needs the laboratory results from that. Take these two together, and they could potentially be applying for licensure in the first quarter of 2021.
So forgive me again for asking a very layperson's question. Are you saying that we could be looking at a scenario where I go to my doctor and my doctor says you can get any one of the following five vaccines?
I think in a public program, that's unlikely. We've had examples of this where the country uses two different kinds of rotavirus vaccines,
Yes.
but that is decided by state. Some states get one kind of vaccine, and other states get another kind of vaccine. However, we have four rotavirus vaccines in the private market, the two that are being used by the program, as well as two others made by multinational companies. So, if you go to a pediatrician, the pediatrician can offer you any of the four vaccines. So, I can see that happening in the private market. I don't see it happening in the public immunization system.
And today, if you had to sort of, you've already said Pfizer you think is inappropriate for India, and you said Genova at the moment gives you the most hope. Would that be accurate to summarize your position as?
That's for the public programs, yes, absolutely. For private care, I think it's a question of, if you can afford to pay multinational prices and buy a vaccine, and the multinationals have gotten it licensed in the country, then yes, you will have that option. What I would like to see is not to have vaccines available in the private sector before they also come into public immunization programs.
And how are you going to, how is anyone going to stop that? Like, how do you establish those boundaries, those ethical boundaries? And talking about ethics, I do want to come to that, but there's a specific medical questionnaire. We'll come to the ethics in a moment. What kind of long-term side effects are we looking at if the vaccine doesn't suit a patient? Would it be fair to say that all of these trials that have made progress thus far do not have any serious side effects from what we know?
At the moment, we don't know of any serious side effects. There were issues with a couple of vaccine trials being stopped for individual patients who had other conditions, and those were found to not be related to the vaccination. That does not mean that there will not be long term side effects, but what we do know from the fact that we have vaccines that have been into tens of thousands of people, that if there are side effects, those side effects are relatively rare, less than 1 in 1,000, but monitoring has to continue.
Right. Now, let's come to the ethics, right? There are all kinds of things happening. Vaccines are making their way into elections, into election promises. There's vaccine nationalism, which I think you've spoken about, others have been concerned about. There's a race between nations. There is going to be countries that are going to prioritize themselves and their people first. So what happens in this scenario from a medical ethics point of view? You've spoken about how till the public health system rolls out, the private players should not be allowed to make their bids. And I think that's such a critical question, because you could actually have people, turning violent, turning on each other to get a vaccine.
I think we need to think about a few things. Vaccines hold a lot of hope, but at the moment, except for specific risk groups, we are actually managing without a vaccine. We've come a long way in 10 months in terms of treatments, in terms of being able to manage patients appropriately, bringing down mortality rates, learning how to screen appropriately, prevent infections. We've gotten this far without vaccines. So I think while vaccines are a great individual and public health solution, we should not think that vaccines are going to solve all problems all by themselves.
I
That's
mean,
not
you know
going
that
to
that's
happen.
going to, what you've just said is going to give the anti-vaxxers sort of add grist to their mills, because there are already people, I have friends among them, some very enlightened people who are saying that by the time the vaccine comes, herd immunity would have set in. This is all one giant pharma profit-chasing conspiracy. I mean, you've heard all of these theories. I'm sure you have friends who talk like this too. But there are two serious questions of science at the heart of this. One, could herd immunity come before the vaccine? Because you yourself have reference to a certain coping capacity, despite the numbers we've seen in certain cities of India, in Delhi, in Ahmedabad, for example, where there's a 60-hour curfew. Two, there are serious questions, and we don't know the answer to this, about whether reinfections are possible. I have personally documented, and I did one story just this week, people who have recovered, tested negative, got discharged from hospital, and then tested positive again, and then died. And what we don't know yet is whether that was a dormant virus and therefore a false negative, or whether they in fact got reinfected. Now, if this indeed is happening, even though this remains an outlier statistically, what does it mean for a vaccine program?
So, the first thing to remember about inducing herd immunity through infection is that you do make a good immune response with infection, but the infectious dose that you get is not necessarily the same as you would get with a vaccination. Will a vaccination induce a better immune response than natural infection? We don't know that either. But what we do know is that vaccines give you a standardized dose of an antigen, and vaccines are designed to induce a good protective immune response. So, if you want to build herd immunity in a predictable fashion, it's more likely that you will be able to do it with vaccination than waiting for the chanciness of natural infections. Where reinfections are concerned, this is a mucosal infection. Your respiratory tract, your gut are essentially mucosa through which you can get infected, right? In mucosal infections, these are not sterile sites. Reinfections are very common. We have a normal flora of the nose, the oral tract, and the gut. So, to see bugs in them that cause disease is actually pretty common. Now, is it passing through or is it causing an infection? That you don't know necessarily with a single point sample unless you can quantify the amount of virus in that sample at each point when the person has tested positive.
But then doesn't it raise questions about the longevity of the immunity, right? So, for example, in a simple sort of way, we know some vaccines, you take them once, you get the shot once, and it's lifelong immunity. Some you need to take annually. What do we
Yeah.
know about these vaccines so far?
We have no idea of the duration of protection, but this week there has been data that came out of UC San Diego and collaborators that seems to indicate that protection might last longer than we initially thought. There was a lot of worry earlier because antibodies were declining after 3 months and people who were positive were turning negative. It turns out that it was the assays, it was the type of antibodies that we were measuring, and maybe what we need to be doing is measuring a composite immune response and not just a single response. There's a lot we don't know about this virus. Certainly, we don't know how long vaccines will protect, but at the moment, it looks hopeful that we do have vaccines that protect in the short term.
Define short term.
Short term is as long as the virus has been around. So the
About,
longer that becomes, the
yeah.
longer we'll have data for. So 8 months is what was published this week.
So you're saying that maybe every 8 months, so far, based on the science we have right now, so far it could be that
No,
every 8 months you would need another vaccine. Am I understanding this wrong?
no. At 8 months, you still have a protective
I
immune
see. The
response.
antibodies will protect
Yes,
you for about 8 months if you've had.
at least 8 months. And as we follow these people up longer, we may find it's 1 year, it's 2 years, because their antibodies haven't gone yet.
So here's the question. If you've had COVID, should you still be taking this vaccine as in when it comes?
Yes, you should. There are many mucosal infections for which we acquire infections first and then take a vaccine, and the vaccine acts as a booster dose. Do you need to take the same numbers of doses of the vaccine? I don't know that yet, but I'm sure that we will be doing the studies that will allow us to answer such questions.
Where do you think the government's attention should be right now? So let's go step by step. Let's say a vaccine comes. You're saying Pfizer and Moderna are almost ruled out for India from a public health distribution point of view. Would it be fair to say that?
I think given price, given distribution, yes, these are both challenging vaccines, Pfizer more than Moderna.
Where should the public health system of India be focusing its attention right now?
I think we should, if we are talking about vaccines and what we should be doing for vaccines, I think we should be facilitating the manufacturers to get phase 3 data that is robust and safety data for large scale trials, and then focusing on getting those vaccines licensed in the country, because we know that Indian manufacturers will make it at prices that we can afford to pay, and the ones that are making vaccines are making it for fitting our distribution system.
Who should get it first?
WHO has come up with a prioritization framework
I
for
saw that.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But do you agree with it?
And in terms of, yes, let's go for healthcare workers first, they are using the principle of reciprocity. These are people who are putting themselves most at risk to be able to handle patients. So, yeah, that makes sense. After that, frontline workers, and there are many definitions of frontline workers, and every country decides for itself, and the elderly and people with comorbidities. In terms of ranking of,
Mm-hmm.
to prevent the severest disease, I think WHO has come up with a pretty reasonable recommendation. But one of the questions that is really coming up in the vaccine community is, if the vaccines really are 90-95% effective in preventing disease and severe disease, it is very, very likely that they are doing something that we had not quite hoped for, which is
Yeah.
prevent transmission. And if we think about transmission, then you should be vaccinating people who spread disease, which is younger people first. So it's an
So
interesting question, and there are
I
mathematical modelers.
and I'm glad you've touched upon it, because the assumption has been that the elderly should get it first after frontline workers and health workers, right? But there are many people who believe that working class, professional, young people who go out, because the elderly may not be going out, and therefore there's a different segment of population that's actually at the risk of contracting it, that is exposed to it in the course of work every day. You can't also have the economy shutting down. So maybe you need to actually change the way you think of this, and you need to give it to younger people before you give it to older people, morally squeamish as that may make us.
I don't think it's about a question of moral squeamishness. There are tools that can help us decide, because you have to decide, one, what your priorities are, and there are enough infectious disease modelers that do vaccine impact modeling that can tell you what the trade offs are in numbers, in terms of how many people will get infected, what it means for the healthcare system, as well as in terms of what it means for the economy.
Yeah. So it's not a closed debate yet. Like, we shouldn't just blindly accept the model that the elderly should get it first.
I think we haven't had the modeling that tells us what the effect of vaccine is going to be. If you take a look at the figures where modeling has been done, the modeling has mostly been Western models,
Yeah.
where they have very high mortality in the elderly, and that's driving a decision to reduce the burden of severe disease and mortality. If we accept that in India that is not the group that has severe disease and the greatest mortality, then we need to build our own models to understand potential vaccine impact.
And do you have a view on this right now, or it's too early to say? We need the numbers, basically.
We need the numbers, and we don't have those.
Okay, lots of questions on the pricing. Now, you said in the beginning of this conversation that you do not believe that the vaccine availability should be based on earning capacity, that it is basically a service provided by the state to its people, and therefore it has to be available to all. But there's a way to ethically argue that from the other side as well, and to say that the exchequer should not be paying for those who can afford to pay for this. And I just want to understand more why you think it should be a service available to all.
I think it's not appropriate to exceptionalize one disease, right?
Yeah.
We have 12 vaccines that are in the program, and those 12 vaccines are provided to everyone for free. Now we've got another vaccine that comes along, and we say, okay, if you can afford to pay for this vaccine, do. I think that can be a recommendation, it should not be a regulation.
And because you believe that once you change the rules for one kind of vaccine, then that you'd have those kind of pressures for every other public health program that's rolled out.
Yeah. I mean,
And
if
it
you were to give me a choice and say, get yourself vaccinated and donate 3 vaccines to people who can't afford it, probably would take that on. But I don't think it should be a rule that somebody can get the vaccine, but you can't.
Okay. Now, we have about 5 minutes left. I just want to take a couple more questions and step back and look at the big picture. Shweta has a question. Can we really trust a vaccine? I've taken this because there's so much skepticism and suspicion around pharmaceutical companies right now. Pfizer's stocks, for example, were observed very carefully, as were Moderna's. And this question reflects that. And also reflects the competitive vaccine nationalism that is taking place on the global stage right now. The question is, can we really trust the vaccine given that every country is in a race to provide a vaccine first and say that we got there first? You have, for example, Russia claiming an efficacy that no data has been released in the public domain, as far as I understand, to back. How do people know which company to believe and trust? Like, who do we believe? How do we get vaccine nationalism out of this equation?
I think this has been a dangerous and damaging game. I think what Russia did, I don't think was appropriate, because you should not be licensing, even a limited licensure, of a vaccine that is based on 39 people receiving a vaccine, which is what it was for Gamaleya.
Yeah.
For China, it was a little bit larger than that. But again, I think vaccines should be tested completely. What we've done in this case is shorten vaccine development by making sure that studies can be done in parallel instead of sequentially, but not removing any step that requires us to test for safety and for efficacy. I think full testing is required. We should not be using any products just because they are first. They should be products for which full data packages are available.
Okay, let's step back and look at the larger picture of where India's fight is with COVID. Now, one of the points that you made is that we're much better today at coping with COVID than we were 5 months ago, undoubtedly. But equally, in terms of our infrastructure keeping pace, I think we're seeing a burden on that again, and I think we're seeing this is happening globally in pockets of Europe, it's happening in the United States of America, right? Is it your understanding that in India, the prevalence of the virus is much wider than the official figures suggest, which is what all serological surveys seem to point to. But the mortality is much lower than what we had feared. In other words, is this virus not as lethal as we had been scared of?
I think the sero surveys are very clear. There's a lot of undetected infection. And since you can't test everybody every day, this undetected spread is going to continue to happen until we have either everybody infected or a vaccine. I think in terms of deaths, again, there is a lot of discussion about why the lower number of deaths, whether all deaths are being reported. But I think given the patterns that we have seen, we are not seeing the levels of mortality in risk groups that
Yeah.
are quite the same as the West. And I can speak for, the hospitals that I know about. Yes, this is a virus that results in fatalities, but not at anything like the levels that my colleagues overseas are reporting.
Why is that? And that remains one of the mysteries of science. There have been theories often saying Indians have prior exposure to zoonotic viruses, or that there is some other mutation of the virus. Does science know the answer to why the infection fatality rate is lower in India, that the kind of mortality we're seeing here is simply not at the scale that the West is seeing?
I don't have an answer to that. I can say that one, the population structure makes a difference. Two, prior exposure to other pathogens may make a difference, because remember that mortality here is not because of the virus as much as it is because of the host response. So if our host response is blunted by prior exposures to many other pathogens, that might be a potential explanation. Another feature might be that because of wider mask wearing, at least among some sections of the population, what we are seeing is lower infectious doses of the virus. And for many viral infections, receiving a lower infectious dose means that you get slower progression of disease, and less severe disease.
Mhm.
Taking all of these together, this may at least be a partial explanation of what's happening. But it's important to remember that India is not exceptional. This is being seen in Africa and in other South Asian countries as well. So there has to be a biological explanation. It may be multifactorial.
Okay, let me take a last question and last word from you. The question is, what about anti-vaxxers, and how will government ensure safety if a normal vaccine takes another few years to be available to all? What is the timeline that we're actually looking at, right? Because all these companies have press releases that talk about 2020, 2021 February. What is the realistic timeline? Like, what are we talking about before we can say everybody can get vaccinated? Until such time, if indeed in India it is not as lethal, as it is in the West, I'm not benchmarking against the other countries that you named, should we avoid panic calls for another lockdown? Because I can see that happening in cities, right? In Delhi, there are calls for a lockdown. In Ahmedabad, the city has shut down in a curfew-like scenario. Is this not a bad idea? Is this not just going to throw the economy off the rails without actually achieving anything purposeful?
So I think in terms of when will we have the vaccines, we will start to have vaccines sometime next year. Whether we will
For how
scale
many people?
to
For how many people? That's
So
the point, right?
if we think about reaching the entire country, that's unlikely to happen before the end of 2022 or sometime into 2023. That's
Yeah.
not too long a timeline to vaccinate 1.3 billion people or 80% of 1.3
Yeah.
billion people. So I think that is something that we should be aiming for. In terms of what we should be doing in the interim, should we lock down or not lock down? I don't think lockdowns make sense. I think what we need to be focusing on is behavior change education. Some of
Yeah.
this is hugely challenging to make people understand social distancing, to make people understand mask wearing. But if we are to change public health, the only way it's going to happen is by making sure that behavior really does change when it comes to the spread of respiratory infections. And this will pay off for us, not only for SARS-CoV-2, but also for influenza, other respiratory viruses, and the next pandemic, which is likely to be respiratory.
But I want to tell you, in rural India, nobody is wearing masks. I've done a lot
Oh,
of traveling, and yes, in the cities, people are being quite good about wearing masks. In fact, according to me, they're wearing masks when we should not be wearing masks. For example, in open spaces with nobody near you while running, like completely
hmm.
counterproductive, completely unscientific. But in rural India, they're not wearing masks. Secondly, we have very dense tenements. We have slum tenements. We have 92 million Indian households that stay in one room homes. What does stay at home mean to them? Like, it means nothing. It's the reason I've become completely anti lockdown.
I don't think stay at home makes sense for people who live in uh, dense housing, because I think if you want to prevent spread of infection there, it makes more sense to take the infected person out of that setting than to leave them there to infect other people. There have been successful examples of doing that, but they have been limited. What we need is a strategy, whether that is an education strategy, which I definitely think is needed for rural areas, where I completely agree with you. The you can't do top down messaging. If you want behavior change, it has to be a participatory learning process, and we haven't invested in that. It's the same beneficiary argument as opposed to making people partners in protecting their health. So I think that definitely needs to change. There's a lot that we can do. Lockdowns, I don't think, are the answers now or for the future.
Final word on the vaccine. You started by saying that you're feeling hopeful, and I think people really need to hear that right now. When you say that all of India probably cannot be vaccinated till the end of 2022, that's another 2 years. There's no way that a lockdown is an efficacious method for another 2 years. I don't even think it's a method for another 2 months. Uh, taking away or reading between the lines, I'm then hearing you say that mask up and live. Mask up and learn to live.
Yes, absolutely. And vaccines will come and vaccines will work. How long they'll work for, we'll find out. But right now, the news is something that people who have worked in vaccines for their entire lives
Yeah.
did not expect them to perform this well. So, science is providing solutions. Now we need to roll them out.
Okay, thank you. I learned a lot. I know our viewers did. Thank you very much, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, one of India's foremost vaccine scientists. I would say the top vaccine scientist, for speaking to us. A pleasure and a lot of things to learn. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.